Well, there's no shortage of engineering advice podcasts out there. What's harder to find is that people talking honestly about the decisions they make, the kind that you really understand after you have been living with the consequences that those decisions brought. And that is what this podcast is about. Over the year, well, I have been working with real system with real constraints. And what I learned is that the hardest part of engineering isn't about learning new tools, it isn't about implementations. It's about making decisions when there isn't a clear right answer. And then standing with it, standing behind it later. This isn't a podcast about framework, trends, or shortcuts. And it isn't about having the perfect answers. Because, come on, there's nothing perfect, right? It's about how engineers actually think, reason, and take responsibility for what they build, especially when things are messy, contextual, and uncertain. If you ever felt the advice you hear sound right in theory, but in reality it falls apart, you are in the right place. I'm Maya, and this is my podcast, Build with Maya. Well, a couple years ago, I was invited for the first time to a podcast as the guest, and was asked a very simple question. What does it mean to be a software engineer? Or to be exact, to be a senior software engineer? At that time, my answer felt very obvious. You own the code. You write clean, correct implementation. You follow best practices. You choose the fastest, the more efficient, the shiny tools out there that can guarantee that your solution will look great. Well, honestly, that answer makes sense and it's still there. But after working in different projects, in different companies, with different teams and different requirements, I got a bit of reality shock. Well, not a dramatic one, people would think, but more like a quiet slap to the face. My eyes just opened wider. Because the first thing you will learn is this. There's no such thing as perfect implementation. What the truth is, there's no such thing like perfect. Anyway, well, we all know this, right? Even if we don't always like to admit that. Remember, there were a very familiar moment when we get into a new code base or PR on someone else's code, and we have to review them for the first time, or maybe a second time, third time, And we always start to think, why was it written this way? Who wrote this code? Well, that's common. And then somehow we never question the same thing about our code until later on when we read our code and we forgot that we are the one who implemented. Well, our own code always seems so reasonable, more reasonable than the others. Well, the truth is, every code base has flaws. Every feature, every implementation has bugs. Whether you define it as feature or bug, it's still a bug. No matter how much experience you have or how careful you are, you still make bugs. Small bugs, big bugs, medium bugs, still have something there to declare that is a bug. You can spend days in centering a div, for example, and something else will still break along the way. And on top of that, we don't work in a vacuum. We work with deadlines. We work teams. So the real question here is, does it actually make sense to spend 3 days centering a div perfectly? Or is it better that the position of the div is already good enough. And those days can go into fixing a more critical problem about performance that can affect thousands of users, can unplug them from what they have been blocked to do, or adding tests to make the system more secure in the long run. And this will also show up in bigger decisions too. Shipping something that's good enough, shipping something fast, or holding it back for polishing a little bit more. Well, on paper, polishing feel very, very, very reasonable and responsible to do, especially for front-end developer. Like, oh, come on, the color is a tiny bit off. Maybe the painting a bit off, like 1 pixel to the left, 1 pixel to the right. But sometimes shipping earlier means you get the feedback you couldn't have predicted. And that ends up being more responsible things to do. And sometimes it's the exact opposite. Well, you never know. Sometimes shipping fast means you pay the price a couple months later for a very long time. So here, the hardest part is there isn't a certain rule tell you which one is right, whether you should care about that polishment and slow down a bit, or you should wait, or you should just go ahead and release something. Well, you have to decide, knowing that you only understand the consequence or the impact much later. Well, it's the same feeling when you see a new set of tools and immediately you fall in love with it and you really want to refactor everything. Remember the first time when React was introduced and everyone got so excited about it? Well, most the time, you really want to just replace the whole code base, jump right into it, refactor your code base, before you actually stop and ask whether it's the real priority right now to do so. That is when it really clicked for me. Engineering is not about writing perfect code. There's no perfect code. It's about deciding what matters right now and what are you willing to live with afterwards. It's what tradeoffs are about. But not just in code, it's also in tool selection, in frameworks, in best practices, in everything. Take on something like clean code. It's a great resource, right? It still is. Every one of us ever always probably heard about clean code once in our lifetime, or even read the book, or even follow some of that. But it doesn't mean that it's the absolute truth. You realize that it's not over time. It's just a guidance. And sometimes the context you're in matter more than just the rule itself. And this is where seniority changes things. Not because senior engineers write better code. Well, the more seniors we become, the less and less code actual we involve. We only involve more and more like high level or something. We do write code, but I'm sure that you write more code than us. But seniors optimize for different things. Less for correctness in less for correctness in isolation, more for impact, sustainability, and consequences over time. That's why I say engineering is not just about implementation code, writing code. It's about decision making, choosing trade-offs, deciding what matters, and owning the outcome, even that they are imperfect. And here is the part that took me the longest time to realize, to understand it. Advice is appealing because it usually comes right. And it sounds very, very reasonable. especially when you hear it in isolation. It's clean, it's confident, and it's often come with a clear rule. And take out the context. It is right, 100%. You should brush your teeth before um you go to work, something like that. That's a good advice, right? The problem is, without context, usually we don't build software without a context, or we don't build software in isolation at all. We build it inside a real system with real people, with real constraints, and with real user scenario. And that's where things got complicated. Because context isn't just one thing. It's the team you are working with, their experience, their habits, their communication. It's time, how much time you actually have, and what coming next. It's the constraints, technical, organizational, sometimes even political. What the priority right now? What is the limit? What is the vision of the organization is heading to? All of this. And it's ownership. Who going to lead with this decision after it ships? And when advice ignore these things, it starts to fall apart. Not because that was a bad advice. No advice is bad. Well, there's some advice really best, obviously, but most advice are not bad. But because it assumes that the world that really exists where this advice works. And this is where consequences come in. You don't feel the cost of decisions immediately. Sometimes the cost show up a bit later, like a week later, a month later, or maybe it show up in extra maintenance or in support or friction in the team. And sometimes it just feels heavier than it should. And you cannot really understand why. It's just a tinkling feelings afterwards. That delay is what makes decision making hard. If consequences were immediate, we all learn much faster. But instead, we make decisions under one set of conditions and live with the rest under a completely different set. The product requirements are based on what current market research, what current discussion with the customer. It doesn't mean that in 2 months from now, it stays the same. And this is why experience reshape what you think. Not because experienced engineers know more rules, but because they've seen how decisions go and how decisions age over time. They felt the long-term cost of something that seemed reasonable at that time. So when you heard advice like always do A, like always use React, always use Vite, always use AI, or never do B, C, D, E, or never use Angular, never use Jenkins, the experience reaction usually isn't agreement or rejection immediately. It's usually a smile like this, and a pause, and a follow-up question. A pause for asking, in what context are you talking about? Which team, under what constraints, and who going to own this later on? And the comments is mostly will be, it depends. It depends a lot. The pause and the comments often different between advice that helps and advice that quietly create problem down the line. So once you start thinking in this pattern, it changes how you show up to your daily work. Not in a dramatic way, not in absolutely become like suddenly out of nowhere you become much better. It just become more and more quiet, intentional change within yourself. For me, it's mostly about how I slow down a bit before I act or before I respond. Not to overthink, but to add a different set of questions. Instead of starting with, what's the best solution? I usually now start nowadays with, what is the goal? What is the optimization goal we are trying for right now? Sometimes the answer I receive will be speed. Sometimes it's about stability. Sometimes about learning. Sometimes about just reducing risk. Or sometimes it's just simply about, yep, we just need to roll out something working. The customer will be unplugged from that, and that's it. The questions, what is that we are optimizing for, alone change a lot of things. It changed how I approach tools. I'm still curious. I still experimenting. You probably will see during the podcast, on my blog posts, on my social media, I experiment a lot of different AI stuff and new framework and so on. But I stopped trying to fall in love quickly like I used to. When I see a new tool now, I don't immediately think, or try not to, we should refactor everything. Well, this is a familiar feelings, right? But these days, that excitement that we should try it immediately, it usually followed by a different question. Is this solving an actual problem that my team is currently facing, or it's just another interesting tool that I need to try it out? Well, we live in a period where things come up every minute, every day. Then previous day, a new AI model come out claiming to be the best out there in the world. Then next following day, something come out and actually makes the previous one become obsolete. Sometimes the answers to the questions about whether it's the actual problem we are having right now, yes, and experimenting makes sense. But over time, the more responsible choice is to step back, understand the real priority, and leave things at how it is right now. Remember the familiar things that they always say? If it works, don't break it. That's very very familiar, right? That things go the same for code. I don't automatically optimize by elegance or completeness. Um, I think about who going to read the code next and how long they likely to live. One of the things that we usually come to the new code page, we usually trying to do in the new code when we encounter the new code page, we try to set our standard. We think that there's a problem with this, and we really want to fix it. But was it worth the effort or not? And who going to read it afterwards? This is the kind of change that, what kind of change whether it's the change that we expected in the near future, you never know. Because writing something isn't technically right, but hard for the team to work with, often end up in the wrong decision. I could have changed the whole code base that written in can be React or can be plain JavaScript with jQuery into TypeScript with proper class, proper typing. But if the team is not familiar with React or not familiar with TypeScript, this is the wrong decision because we need to make sure they are used to it first. The concept introduced, and they're okay with going with that. Otherwise, it's become a real bad decision because no one understands how to move from there. It will cause friction. And this way of thinking also changed how I react to advice. Instead of asking, is it a good advice? I ask, When would the advice become good and when wouldn't it be? That shift doesn't happen over time. Like it doesn't happen immediately. That shift doesn't give you the faster answer actually, but it does give you better ones. Maybe it make your process of thinking a bit slower, and you don't jump right into code immediately or solution immediately, but it does make you consider different things and come up with a more reasonable decision afterwards. So if there's one thing I want you to take from this episode, this is this. Engineering is not about having the right answer come up front. It's about learning how to make decisions that you're willing to understand and stand behind, even when things are messy, contextual, and imperfect. That's the space I want my podcast to live in. Well, some episodes will be reflection like this. Some will be just experiments. I like experimenting. Tools, workflow, new AI tools, idea I'm trying, and I'm still exploring about that. And some will be conversation with other folks about trade-off, or maybe with me and you, ownership, what experience really changed over time. What you don't hear here in this podcast would not be about tutorials, hype, trendy, or universal answer. It's not because those things is problematic or bad. It's just because they often skip the part what matters the most in our professional daily life context. This podcast is for engineers who care about what they think. People who feel the gap between advice and reality. People want to build with intention and not just for the momentum. If this sounds like you, well, I'm really glad you're here. If I'll leave you with one question before we finish, the one that I always come back often to myself. What are the decisions or trade-off you are thinking of right now when you're hearing this podcast? You don't have to answer right now. You don't even have to have that answer. Even think about it, even naming it is good enough. If you want to keep exploring this kind of conversation, follow my podcast, Be with Maya. And if you feel like sharing what you're thinking through in a comment or reply a message, that would be great. I really love to hear those. Because what? Sharing and caring. Thank you for listening. And thank you for taking the time to think a little bit more intentionally about how you build and how you work. See you in the next